It was a day like any other when I first noticed the oddity that would change everything. I had returned to my island after months of being away, expecting the peaceful, untouched sanctuary I had grown accustomed to, the smell of salt in the air, the distant call of seabirds, and the rhythmic crashing of waves against the rocks. This island wasn't just a piece of land to me. It was a part of my soul, something I had poured my time, money, and energy into preserving. It was a retreat from the world, a place untouched by human hands, where nature reigned supreme. I'd made it clear to anyone who would listen, especially the local authorities, that this land was not to be developed, not to be altered. It was protected, or so I thought. As I stood on the edge of the cliff that overlooked the dense forest and the shoreline, something caught my eye. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow on the horizon, a flicker in the corner of my view that seemed almost too surreal to be real. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just the angle of the sun, or perhaps the way the trees were casting long shadows as the day started to wane. But as I squinted, straining to make out the shape, my heart skipped a beat. There they were, a line of buildings. Not just one or two, but an entire row of structures, small and squat, their rooftops peeking through the treetops, nestled uncomfortably against the natural landscape. The cabins stood there almost mocking me, a violation of everything I held dear. There were too many of them to ignore. Dozens, 50, maybe more. A wave of disbelief swept over me, followed by a sharp, sudden realization that the island I had spent years protecting and preserving was now a construction site, without my permission, without my consent. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of joke? A tourist attraction? No, this wasn't something that could have been planned in a moment of miscommunication. I knew the island. I knew every rock, every ridge, every trail. I knew what was supposed to be here, and cabins were not part of the plan. 1,000 thoughts collided in my head, but one thing became immediately clear. Someone had done this. Someone had invaded my island, constructed these cabins under my nose, and I had no idea how or why it had happened. The first thing that came to mind was the Homeowners Association, the HOA. I'd been dealing with them for years, fighting against their endless encroachments and unsolicited opinions on how the island should be managed. But I had no idea they would go this far. I hadn't seen any formal approval, no permits, no indication that they had any jurisdiction over the land. I thought I was safe. The land was protected, zoned for conservation, and I had kept every document in place. But here they were. I grabbed my binoculars from the truck and focused on the cabins, trying to make sense of the situation. They looked like prefabricated units, nothing too fancy, but certainly not something you'd expect to see on a secluded island, especially not without any prior warning. It wasn't just the fact that they were there, it was the audacity, the sheer lack of respect for boundaries, for what had been established. They hadn't even bothered to notify me. I had left the island in the hands of the authorities, under the assumption that the conservation efforts would be honored and upheld. I had trusted that everything was in order. But this was something I never could have imagined. As I scoured the area with my binoculars, I noticed a series of trucks parked near the cabins. Workers were milling around, unloading supplies, clearly setting up for something. There was no doubt about it now. This wasn't just a one-off mistake. This was an operation, a well-planned development. Someone had put in a considerable amount of effort to get these cabins built, and it wasn't me. It wasn't just an isolated cabin here or there. The cabins were spaced out in a meticulous pattern, as if someone was preparing for a large influx of guests. There were no signs, no construction flags, no safety barriers, nothing that would indicate a legitimate construction project. It all looked like a hidden, almost clandestine operation. My stomach churned. My initial shock quickly turned to fury. I pulled out my phone, frantically dialing the local authorities, the conservation office, anyone I could think of who might have some answers. But my calls went unanswered, or worse, were redirected to voicemail. No one was answering. No one was even acknowledging the situation. I hung up and tried again, but the feeling of helplessness was starting to overwhelm me. They had done this without my knowledge, and now no one seemed to be taking it seriously. That was when the full scale of the betrayal hit me. These cabins weren't just an eyesore. They were a blatant violation of everything I had worked for. I had spent years ensuring that this island would remain untouched. And now I was faced with the brutal reality that several people, had decided they could just come in and build on my land without so much as a word to me. And that wasn't even the worst part. As I stood there on the cliff, seething with anger and disbelief, I realized something even more alarming. The HOA had been involved. They had the power to make this happen. They had made this decision, bypassing my rights as the landowner, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The thought of it made my blood run cold. I had heard rumors about the HOA's overreach before, but I had never thought they would go this far. It wasn't just that they had built without permission. It was the fact that they had thought they could get away with it, that they could treat my land as if it were their own. As I made my way down to the beach, my mind raced with 1,000 questions. Why had they done this? Who had authorized the construction? And why hadn't anyone notified me? There was no way this was legal. There was no way they could have gone through the proper channels and gotten approval for this development. And yet there they stood, taunting me with their presence. I had always prided myself on being a responsible steward of the land, making sure every tree, every rock, every inch of this island was protected and respected. But now I realized my efforts had been in vain. The island was no longer just mine. It had become the HOA's playground, and I had no say in the matter. The fury that had begun to rise within me now exploded. This wasn't just about cabins on an island. This was about control. This was about someone trying to take away what was rightfully mine, and I wasn't going to stand for it. It was time to take action. I would make them pay for what they had done. The sense of powerlessness began to gnaw at me as I made my way down the rocky trail toward the cabins. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing with disbelief. It didn't make sense. This couldn't have happened without someone pulling strings, and it was becoming increasingly clear to me that the HOA had orchestrated this entire operation. But how? Who had they bribed? Who had they threatened? As I walked through the dense underbrush, trying to make my way down to the beach where I could get a closer look at the cabins, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settling in my stomach. The anger that had bubbled up inside me after first discovering the cabins was now tinged with something much darker. Fear. Fear of what the HOA was capable of, fear of how far they had pushed the boundaries of power, and fear of how little I could do to stop them. This wasn't just about an unauthorized construction project. It was about a deliberate power play, an assertion of dominance that I had no idea how to counter. By the time I reached the edge of the water, my feet sinking into the wet sand, I realized I had no clear answers. The cabins were still there, standing tall, their presence mocking me with every passing second. I approached the first one cautiously, my eyes scanning for any signs of life. A faint murmur of voices drifted on the wind, the faint sound of hammering in the distance. It was as if the people working on the cabins had no care in the world, no concern for who owned the land, no fear of retribution. They had been given carte blanche to do whatever they wanted, and they were doing it with impunity. The smell of fresh wood and sawdust hung in the air as I drew closer to the nearest cabin. I could hear the sound of a power tool buzzing behind the walls, and I felt a cold fury rise within me. How could they have done this without so much as a word to me? How could they have thought this was acceptable? I wanted to confront them, to demand answers. But a part of me knew it would do no good. I had to find out who was behind this, and I had to do it without tipping them off that I was on to them. I turned back, retreating into the woods with a mixture of frustration and determination. I knew I needed to gather information, but I had to be careful. If I pushed too hard, I could make things worse. The HOA was not the kind of organization to back down easily. They had a history of getting their way no matter what. I had seen it firsthand with the various issues that had come up in the past. Zoning laws, property disputes, regulations that seemed to be twisted in their favor. They had always operated in the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes, but this was something different. This was too bold, too public. And it wasn't just about the construction. It was about control. It was about asserting dominance over the land, and by extension, over me. I had to know how they'd managed to get away with this. The first thing I did when I returned to my cabin was pull out my laptop and start digging. I'd already tried calling the local authorities, the conservation offices, and even the HOA directly, but no one had answered. It was as if they were all in on it, a conspiracy that I had no idea how to unravel. But I wasn't about to give up. I wasn't going to let them steal my island from me. As I scrolled through endless documents, zoning laws, and permit records, I found nothing that even hinted at approval for this construction. There were no permits filed, no requests for zoning changes, no public notices. It was as if they had simply bypassed the law altogether. My mind raced, and I couldn't help but wonder how they had managed to get away with it. Who had been involved? Who had signed off on this? Was there some kind of backdoor deal? I knew the HOA had a reputation for bending the rules, but this was something else entirely. They had to have known that this was illegal, that this was a blatant violation of property laws. And yet, there they were, building their cabins with no consequences. The thought made my blood boil. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was incensed. How dare they do this to me? How dare they think they could just come in and take over my land like it was nothing? I slammed my laptop shut, the weight of frustration settling over me. But even as the anger threatened to consume me, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't back down. Not now, not when they had crossed such a line. I had to fight. And that meant finding out who had the power to make this happen. Over the next few days, I spent every waking moment gathering information, following leads, and speaking to anyone who might have information about the HOA's involvement. I reached out to former employees of the HOA, local contractors, even people who lived in the area and had dealt with them before. Every conversation brought me closer to the truth, but also further into a web of deceit. The HOA wasn't just a local group of homeowners trying to keep up property values. They were connected, deeply connected, to powerful people in local government, law enforcement, and even private contractors. This wasn't just a case of a few rogue individuals taking matters into their own hands. This was a well-oiled machine, a group of people who had figured out how to manipulate the system for their own gain. As the pieces started to fall into place, I began to realize just how deeply entrenched the HOA was in the local community. They had ties to influential people in city planning, construction, and even the local police. It was as if they had created their own little kingdom, and I was nothing more than an outsider, someone who had no say in what happened to the land I owned. The more I uncovered, the more the sense of powerlessness returned. But I wasn't about to give up. The fight wasn't over. The realization that they had more control than I'd ever anticipated only made me more determined. I couldn't let them get away with it. I had to make them pay for what they had done, but how? How could I possibly fight against an organization that seemed to be above the law? The answer came to me in a flash. If they thought they could take my land from me without permission, then maybe it was time to make them pay for every inch they had taken. Maybe it was time to turn the tables and use their own tactics against them. I began to formulate a plan. I would use the very thing they had used to build these cabins in the first place: their power, their influence, and their legal loopholes. But this time, I would do it on my terms. The HOA had overstepped, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Not now, not ever. As the days wore on, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The initial shock had faded into a cold, simmering rage. I had spent my entire life keeping this island safe. And now, here I was, standing on the precipice of a battle with an enemy I didn't fully understand. The Homeowners Association, an organization I had always thought of as a nuisance, a petty bureaucracy focused on petty rules and regulations, had proven themselves far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. They had turned my beloved sanctuary into a playground for their own ambitions, with no regard for the damage they had caused. And now, they had made the critical mistake of underestimating me. They thought they could just waltz in, break the law, and get away with it. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I wasn't just fighting for my property. I was fighting for control over my life, my land, and everything I had worked so hard to preserve. The more I dug into the HOA's operations, the more I realized how intricately they were woven into the fabric of the local power structure. They weren't just a small group of homeowners. They were the puppet masters pulling the strings of everyone who mattered. Local officials, contractors, police officers, they all seemed to answer to the HOA in some way. It was as if they had their hands in every corner of the community, using their influence to bend the rules and ensure their own dominance. I had always known there was something off about the HOA, but I had never realized how far their reach extended. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized that there was no way I could fight them head on. Not through traditional means. They had too much power. They had too many resources. They had the law on their side, or at least it seemed that way. But I was far from powerless. I had something they didn't. The one thing they couldn't control. My land. They had taken it from me without permission, without a single legal document to back their actions, but that didn't mean they had the right to keep it. I had inherited this island, and the law, at least in theory, was on my side. They couldn't just steal it from me. That was where my plan began to take shape. The first thing I needed to do was expose their deception. The cabins they had built weren't just an illegal construction project. They were evidence of something far more sinister. If I could gather enough proof that the HOA had bypassed the law, that they had acted without proper permits or oversight, I could take them to court. It wasn't going to be easy. I was up against an organization with seemingly unlimited resources, but I had something they didn't: the truth. But I couldn't just rely on the courts. That would take too long, and I couldn't afford to wait for justice. I needed to strike fast, to hit them where it hurt. And the best way to do that, I realized, was through their own weakness: greed. The HOA had built these cabins under the guise of providing an exclusive retreat for their members, a way to boost their image and line their pockets with more money. They had violated my land for profit, and they had done it under false pretenses. What if I could turn that back on them? What if I could find a way to make them pay for their own greed? The thought struck me with a sudden clarity. The cabins weren't just buildings. They were now assets with monetary value. I had an idea. What if I made the HOA pay for the right to use them? What if I could turn the tables and make them pay rent for every single one of those cabins they had built on my land? The more I thought about it, the more it made sense. If they had taken my land, they should pay for the privilege. And the best part was that I didn't even need their permission to do it. All I had to do was start charging them rent, and once I did, I would have them right where I wanted them. They had no legal claim to the land. They had no right to build there. They were trespassing, and if I could establish that, I could demand compensation. But this wasn't just about money. It was about making a statement. It was about forcing the HOA to acknowledge that they could no longer take whatever they wanted without consequence. They had crossed a line, and now it was time to make them pay for it. The plan started coming together quickly. I contacted a local lawyer who had dealt with property disputes before. I couldn't afford to waste time on a drawn-out legal battle, so I needed someone who could think outside the box, someone who could help me strike quickly and effectively. The lawyer, a sharp woman named Emily, was immediately intrigued by the idea of charging the HOA rent for the cabins. She recognized the potential in the strategy and agreed to help me, but she also warned me that it wouldn't be an easy fight. The HOA would fight back, of course. They would argue that they had built the cabins in good faith, that they had the necessary permits, that they were simply improving the land for the benefit of the community. But Emily and I both knew the truth. They had done this without permission, and they had done it for their own gain. The first step was to get a formal appraisal of the land. I needed to know the value of the cabins, the potential revenue they could generate, and how much the HOA should be paying in rent. We spent the next few days surveying the property, bringing in experts to assess the situation. It was a complicated process, but Emily was determined to get it right. In the meantime, I began gathering evidence of the HOA's illegal actions. I contacted former employees of the HOA who had knowledge of the construction process, local government officials who had been involved in zoning decisions, and even contractors who had worked on the cabins. The more I dug, the more I uncovered, and the more I realized just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. They had used their influence to bypass zoning laws, to manipulate local regulations, and to get away with something that no one else would have been allowed to do. But that was about to change. With Emily's help, I filed a formal complaint with the local authorities, demanding an investigation into the HOA's actions. We didn't have much hope that the authorities would act quickly, but we knew it was the first step in the process. I was prepared for a long, drawn-out fight. But I was also prepared to make the HOA pay, for the land they had stolen and for the damage they had caused. As the weeks passed, the pressure began to mount. The HOA started to take notice of my actions. They sent letters, warning me to cease and desist, claiming that I had no right to charge them rent. But I wasn't backing down. I had a lawyer, I had evidence, and I had the law on my side. They thought they could bully me into submission, But they hadn't counted on one thing: my determination. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But I was ready. I wasn't just going to sit by and let them take what was mine. I was going to make them pay, not just with money, but with their reputation, with their power, and with their pride. They had made a huge mistake by taking my land, and now they were going to feel the consequences of their actions. This was more than just a property dispute. This was a fight for justice, and I wasn't going to lose. The weight of the plan was starting to bear down on me. As the days bled into weeks, I could feel the pressure mounting. I had set the wheels in motion, and now it was just a matter of time before everything would come to a head. The HOA had underestimated me, and in their overconfidence, they had made a fatal mistake. I knew they would push back. They had far more resources at their disposal than I did. They were backed by a network of lawyers, lobbyists, and influential figures who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. But that was exactly why my plan had to work. I couldn't afford to go up against them head-on in a battle of legal might. I needed to use their own arrogance against them. The first legal filings had been submitted, and the wheels of bureaucracy were turning. Emily, my lawyer, was diligent, pushing forward with the complaint. But in the back of my mind, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple court case. It was going to be a battle of wits, of strength, and of endurance. I wasn't just trying to get the cabins removed. No, that would be too easy. I wanted to bleed them dry. I wanted to expose them for the frauds they were, to make them pay for every moment they had thought they could walk over me. As the HOA sent their cease and desist letters, threatening me with everything from fines to lawsuits, I was calm. Too calm, perhaps. I had already anticipated these moves, and I had prepared for them. I wasn't going to back down. I had become far more strategic now, relying on Emily's expertise to navigate the legal process while I focused on undermining their credibility. The letters they sent me only reinforced my resolve. They thought that sending a few threats would intimidate me into submission, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. Each letter I received was a reminder of how far they had gone to trample over my rights, to steal from me with the confidence that no one would fight back. But I wasn't just anyone. And soon, they would learn that lesson the hard way. I knew I needed to hit them where it hurt the most: their image. They couldn't afford a scandal. The HOA prided itself on being a respectable organization, an entity that held the moral high ground in the community. But the truth was, they were built on corruption, deceit, and greed. And I had the evidence to prove it. I began quietly gathering more details, reaching out to other disgruntled landowners who had suffered at the hands of the HOA. I spoke to people who had been bullied by the HOA, people whose lands had been zoned and sold off without their consent. It wasn't just me. This was part of a pattern, a decades-long history of exploitation. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized how many people would support me. This wasn't just about me and my land. It was about standing up to a corrupt system that had been running unchecked for far too long. The tipping point came when I received an anonymous tip. Someone within the HOA had grown tired of the corruption and wanted to help. At first I was skeptical, but I knew I had to act fast. The tip-off was simple but critical. The HOA had forged several permits for the cabins. They had manipulated local government officials into signing off on the project without following the proper channels. The cabins had been built on land that was technically zoned for conservation. They had gotten away with it for months, and no one had raised an eyebrow because they had the right connections. But that was about to change. Armed with this new information, Emily and I quickly took action. We began to dig into the specific permits and zoning documents, cross-referencing them with the legalities of the land's zoning. We filed an amended complaint, including the newly discovered evidence of fraud. The stakes were higher now. The HOA could no longer claim that their construction was legitimate. They had forged documents, deceived local authorities, and bypassed zoning laws. They were no longer the well-intentioned community organization they had claimed to be. They were criminals. I knew this would shake things up, but what I hadn't anticipated was the full-scale retaliation that followed. The HOA was no longer content with sending threats. They were coming after me personally. One afternoon, I returned to my cabin to find a group of men waiting for me on my doorstep. They were lawyers, private investigators, and what I could only assume were henchmen hired by the HOA to intimidate me. They made it clear that they weren't interested in a legal battle. They weren't interested in negotiating. Their message was simple: back down, or there would be consequences. At first, the threats didn't faze me. I had been expecting this. But the more they spoke, the more I realized just how far the HOA was willing to go to protect their interests. They had the money, the power, and the will to do whatever it took to crush me. But I wasn't going to cower in fear. I had come too far. I had lost too much. This was my island, and I wasn't going to let them take it from me. I stood tall, looking them in the eyes, and told them that they could try all they wanted, but I wasn't backing down. If they wanted a fight, they would get one, and it wouldn't be just a legal fight. It would be a fight for the truth, for justice, and for the future of my land. As the men left, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA was going to throw everything they had at me, but I had something they didn't: determination. The next few weeks were a blur of legal motions, counterclaims, and growing tension. The HOA's attempts to intimidate me only fueled my resolve. I began to fight back in ways I hadn't even considered before. I reached out to local media outlets hoping to bring attention to the scandal. I contacted journalists who had covered similar stories of corruption in the past, offering them the evidence I had collected. The HOA was no longer just an opponent I was fighting in a courtroom. They were becoming the subject of public scrutiny. And as more and more people began to take notice, the cracks in their once pristine image began to show. Then came the day I had been waiting for, the court date. Emily and I walked into the courtroom, confident that we had built a strong case. The HOA had fought tooth and nail, trying to dismiss the charges, but with the evidence we had gathered, we had them cornered. The moment the judge ruled in my favor, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was a significant victory. The HOA had been ordered to cease all operations on the island, to remove the cabins they had illegally built, and to compensate me for the damages. The weight of the victory settled over me like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just the money, the land, or the cabins that I had won back. It was the principle. It was the satisfaction of knowing that the system had worked, that justice had been served. But even as I stood there feeling the rush of triumph, I knew this was only the beginning. The HOA would not go quietly. They would regroup, retaliate, and try to find new ways to undermine me. But now I was ready. I had fought the battle of my life and won, and I wasn't about to let them take anything else from me. This wasn't just about taking back my island. It was about proving that even the most powerful, seemingly invincible entities could be brought to their knees. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't over yet. But I had won the first round, and that was all that mattered. The victory in court was bittersweet. The ruling was in my favor, but it didn't feel like the definitive ending I had hoped for. The judge's decision was a monumental one. The cabins were to be torn down, the HOA was ordered to pay compensation, and the illegal permits were nullified. For a moment, I thought I had won, but as I walked out of the courthouse that day, I realized something fundamental. The fight wasn't over. This was only a small skirmish in a larger war. The HOA, battered but not broken, wasted no time in regrouping. The ruling did not go unnoticed, and I could feel the tension in the air as their representatives made it clear that they would appeal. But what struck me was their silence. They were playing the waiting game now, trying to maneuver their way out of the consequences. But I had learned from the past. Waiting wasn't going to work this time. I wasn't going to let them drag me through another round of litigation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this had never just been a legal battle. It had been a fight for something far deeper. It had been about control, about power, and about standing up to the abuses of an organization that thought they could manipulate the system without consequences. But the legal victory had shifted the ground beneath their feet. They couldn't just ignore it anymore. The story had spread beyond the confines of the courtroom. The media had picked up on the case, and soon, people from all walks of life were following the saga of the island and its battle with the HOA. I could feel the momentum building. Public sentiment was on my side, and that was something the HOA hadn't anticipated. They thought they could bully me into submission, but now the tables had turned. However, I knew that the HOA wasn't going to give up easily. They had too much to lose. Their reputation, their power, and the money they stood to gain from the cabins were all on the line. So I prepared myself for what I knew was coming next, their final act of desperation. They weren't going to let it go quietly, and I couldn't afford to rest on my laurels. I had to be ready for whatever they had up their sleeves. A few weeks after the ruling, I received a call from Emily. Her voice was tense, and I could tell that something was wrong. The HOA wasn't just appealing the case. They had found a new way to play the game. They had managed to pull some strings and get the case moved to a different court, one that was known for being more lenient toward organizations like the HOA. It felt like a punch to the gut. Just when I thought I had them cornered, they had found another way to avoid the consequences of their actions. I had expected them to fight back, but I hadn't anticipated this level of manipulation. They had the money and influence to keep pushing, and it seemed like the legal system was bending under the weight of their power. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not again. I wasn't going to allow them to undermine the victory I had fought so hard for. Determined not to let the appeal process drag on, I made a decision. It was time to escalate the fight. I had been playing by the rules of the system for too long, waiting for the law to provide justice. But that wasn't working. I realized that the only way to truly hit them where it hurt was by targeting their operations head-on. The moment I made this decision, I knew what I had to do. I reached out to a group of investigative journalists I had met during the course of the case. They had been following the HOA's activities for years and had long suspected foul play in their dealings. They were interested, but I had one stipulation. This had to be a full-scale exposé. The public had to see the HOA for what they truly were, a corrupt, manipulative organization that used their power to bend the rules and take advantage of everyone in their path. The media was the key. They could shine a spotlight on the hidden dealings of the HOA, expose their underhanded tactics, and ensure that they would never be able to hide behind the veil of respectability again. The investigation began in earnest. Emily and I, along with the journalists, spent weeks digging through the HOA's records, interviewing former employees, and tracking down whistleblowers. What we uncovered was staggering. It wasn't just the cabins. The HOA had been systematically exploiting landowners for years, pressuring them into signing over land rights, bypassing zoning laws, and engaging in shady deals with local contractors. Their entire operation was built on a foundation of lies, and we had the proof. We were ready to expose them for the frauds they were. As we prepared to release the story to the public, the pressure mounted. The HOA, realizing they had been caught, began to lash out. They attempted to silence the journalists, sending legal threats and threatening to sue anyone who spoke out. But it was too late. The wheels of public outrage were already in motion, and there was no way they could stop it now. When the story hit the news, it was like an explosion. The media coverage was relentless. Investigative reports were aired on local television, detailed articles were published in newspapers, and social media exploded with condemnation. The HOA could no longer hide behind their carefully crafted image. The truth was out, and they were exposed for what they truly were. People in the community, who had once turned a blind eye to their tactics, were now outraged. They began to demand action from local authorities, and the pressure was too great to ignore. Public sentiment had shifted, and the HOA found themselves in a position they couldn't escape. The final blow came when the local government, under intense public pressure, launched a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. They began auditing their financials, investigating their dealings with contractors, and scrutinizing their property acquisitions. The result was swift. Several board members were forced to resign, and the HOA was hit with fines, penalties, and lawsuits that drained their coffers. The community rallied together, pushing for reform. And for the first time in years, the HOA's grip on power was broken. As I watched the downfall of the organization that had once held such influence, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. I had won, not just for myself, but for the countless others who had suffered at the hands of the HOA. My island was safe, the cabins were demolished, and I had taken back control over what was rightfully mine. But more importantly, I had exposed the corrupt system that had allowed them to operate unchecked for so long. In the months that followed, life on the island slowly returned to normal. The peace I had once cherished was restored, and the land once again felt like mine. The battle had taken its toll, but it had also reaffirmed something I had always known: that no matter how powerful the opposition, the truth always has a way of coming to light. The HOA was no longer the shadowy force it once was. Their empire had crumbled, and they would never again be able to operate with the same impunity. For me, this wasn't just a victory over the HOA. It was a victory over fear, over manipulation, and over the forces that sought to control my life. The island was mine again, and I had reclaimed my future. The victory was hard-earned, but in the end it was worth every moment of the fight. As I stood on the cliff once more, looking out over the now pristine land, I felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The war was over, and I had won. In Section 5, the protagonist fights back against the HOA's appeal and ultimate manipulation by exposing their corruption to the public. The final confrontation brings about the downfall of the HOA, with a combination of legal pressure, media exposure, and public outcry. The protagonist not only regains their land, but also helps dismantle the powerful system that sought to exploit them, symbolizing a powerful victory over corruption and greed.